All right, 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We are picking up in verse 25. To do this, just a quick reminder, this has begun the second major section in the book of 1 Corinthians. First one covered two issues that were brought to Paul's attention by those of the household of Chloe about the problems of division and the problem of immorality that needed to be addressed. He did that, chapters 1 through 4, and then 5 and 6. And now he is addressing questions that they had, generally speaking. And we've talked multiple times about the reason why, what are mostly people coming from a pagan background, why they would have so many questions that we would think are very basic. Well, they're basic to us because of the influence over time of these things are taken for granted. For them, they were not. So they were completely changing everything just about their lives to become Christians. And as a result of that, they had a lot of these questions then that even revolved around basic things, and that's, as he started, about marriage. What should we do in these situations? And what we notice, if you see verses 1 through 9, are a kind of introduction to this, and you go through a transition from the problem of fornication, which he was saying, this is a problem. Well, the natural question is, so you're saying all sex is bad? He says, no, that's not what I'm saying. He says, let's put this into the whole context of marriage and what it should be there and how that marriage should operate, but then also that there are situations which even marriage is not a good idea because of other things. That's kind of the introduction going through verse 9 that he develops then through the chapter. So we just completed a section that began in verse 10 and went through verse 24 that was really dealing with these situations of marriage. And he began with the very basic fundamental, which is you follow what the Lord says, which is you don't divorce. That's what he says. And he points back to that fact, and then he goes into the specifics. Okay, I know that the Lord did not speak specifically on what to do in this situation. And he addresses the problem you get into, does that still apply if my spouse is not a Christian? And the answer is, yes, it does. So long as they are fine with everything, then absolutely, and everything's good with the kids, you're married, God recognizes that, that's great, and you can have a great influence on them that they might obey the gospel. That's ultimately what he is pointing out, and that little phrase, not under bondage, is, as he's going to show later on, but that's only so long as they accept your Christianity. If they are not going to accept your Christianity and are going to pressure you to leave Christ, then you let them go. And you accept that. It doesn't say anything about giving them, at that point, some reason to remarry. He's saying Jesus takes precedence. It's obey God rather than man. Acts chapter 5, verse 29. And then we looked last week at verses 17 through 24, which is it's kind of going into detail about it to say, now this principle of that, okay, that would be okay to let go, there are limitations on how I want you to apply that. And he showed two major applications of this. One was the idea of if you're a slave, okay, remember, not under bondage. Don't take this too far, everybody. I said not under bondage. If you're a slave, that doesn't mean you get to go free now. That's not what I'm talking about. Okay, and so he wanted to make sure and get that part across, and also the idea of being circumcised versus uncircumcision. And the whole point is that these kind of things, because of your social status, marriage the home is a social institution created by God, so they're divine too, social institution. But then you have in society, you have the race differences and then your class differences. And he said, the big point here was Jesus did not die to have a social revolution. You are to accept these things as they are and use whatever situation you have, Jew, Gentile, slave free, and you are to live your life for Christ in those situations. So he's wanting to make sure and qualify that there wasn't any misunderstanding about what he meant and what he'd said above. Now, as we come down to verse 25, you can see when he says, now concerning virgins. And if you'll just notice this, he actually uses a rhetorical marker of saying now concerning. He'll regularly do that through this book to note he's moving on to something different. Okay, a new question. This, in ways, goes back to what he is saying in verses 8 and 9. And he has already introduced that subject matter in the introduction of the chapter. And he's now getting on to, now I'm going to address this specifically about what to do. So we're now doing the unmarried, and all those principles apply, and to the widows, which he's going to specifically address in verse 39. So that's kind of the organization of the chapter as you move through. So now we look at this, and there's some confusing language in this section as well, but we'll try to look at it and apply it and put it in its context historically for you. So he says, now concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. Okay, so we've already noted a distinction he made if you go all the way back to verse 10 and then verse 12, where he had said, now to the married I command you, not I, but the Lord. And that is saying, I'm just going to tell you what the Lord said. And then in verse 12, but to the rest, I, not the Lord, say. That is, the Lord didn't specifically address this. So now he's using a similar kind of reference when he says here, I have no commandment from the Lord. Okay? He's saying on this, we don't have a command as far as right and wrong from the Lord about this situation. Okay? That's the first thing. And then he says, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. So here's what we have. The Apostle Paul is saying, I do not have a command for the Lord, but I can give judgment. Now, I want to ask a general question as we begin this and say, what does this tell us about inspiration? I just went totally a different direction than you ever thought about, I know. The point I'm making is that even the judgment was inspired. But it's inspired judgment, okay? And so here is Paul being guided by the Holy Spirit to distinguish between something that is absolute command versus something that is a judgment call. Now, the first thing of why this matters is that, as he's going to get into in chapter 8, that these things exist. That there are going to be instances in which judgment is required. That is, either way could be decided and not be sinful, as he's going to point out. That doesn't mean there's not a good judgment and a bad judgment. It's to make sure you understand the difference between the two. Okay? And that's where we often have, I'd say, we haven't done enough work on this, generally speaking, in the church, because we have to recognize that you handle these things differently. Okay? He's still going to give the instruction. He's still going to give advice, but it's going to be acknowledged as advice. Okay? So we have to make sure that we know, first of all, where something falls. Is this an absolute scripture, here's how it's done, or does it fall into the realm of judgment? And that is, there are options that God has allowed within this framework. Now, so the first thing you have to establish is authority. That is what God says. And that's, why does this matter? Because he's established his framework of authority in marriage in what preceded it. Everything else of what he's about to say is dependent upon what he already said about marriage. He's already set down what the lines are. Don't get divorced. He's referring to the Lord. He doesn't himself give the exception of fornication in this passage. The Lord does. But he's just saying, here's what you do. So when he is coming through this then, so he's just buttressed that and said, this is what we're going to follow. So now when what follows, this is not new information that contradicts what he just said. He is working within the framework of the commandments to talk about judgment within situations that are acceptable to the Lord already. That's why I think this matters to understand. Now there's a broader way that applies in a lot of different things, but we'll stick with the text specifically for the application before us. He's giving judgment, and then there is an inspired judgment. This is better. Okay. And it's interesting how he describes this, as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. He's talking about himself. So what does he say? He considers himself one whom the Lord, in his mercy, has made trustworthy. I want you to stop and think about what Paul is saying about himself here. First of all, in his mercy. It's in the Lord's mercy. What is he referring to? How had Paul seen the Lord's mercy? Okay, thank you, Paco. He had persecuted the church. He'd had an opportunity, and the nature of mercy is God essentially treating us according to what we need, not what we deserve. Paul deserved punishment for what he had done. He received what he needed, which was the gospel from Ananias. That was the Lord's mercy, which provided this opportunity for him, which is grace. So he sees, the reason why I bring that up is, Paul, at various times in his epistles, he finds ways to work in an acknowledgement of his past. Paul does not run from who he was. He's ashamed of it. He's saddened by it, but he doesn't run from it. That's really who he was. That's really what he did. People know that. So instead, he doesn't emphasize it either, though. He doesn't go around talking about all the Christians he used to persecute. The only time he ever brings that up is when it is for the context of people that don't know him, as you look, say, in Acts 22 and Acts 26. What does he do with it? He tells you this, but he does it in such a way as to glorify God in the process. It's the Lord's mercy that puts me in this position. I didn't deserve it. So it acknowledges his own weakness while putting the Lord forward. As a mindset, that itself is really important for anything we do. But then he follows that. He says he's made trustworthy, okay? Faithful. Okay? He's treating Paul as being faithful. The work that Paul has done now, he's been given all sorts of responsibility as an apostle. And that's what he wants them to see when he gives advice. Is someone who has benefited from the Lord's care, mercy, but someone who has also shown themselves and recognized as being faithful to the Lord. So he put his whole life into context as to offer this advice to people. He gave his own advice context. He said, I'm trying to tell you this from this point of view. So now verse 26, we look at what he is going to recommend. I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. And so if you wonder, well, what are we talking about? Verse 27, are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. So right now, he says, because of the present distress, which we don't need to talk about, everyone just stay as you are. Now, again, this is not a statement about, okay, well, you're committing adultery right now, and so you just stick it out. That's not what he's saying here. That's why I said about the contextualization of all of this. He's pointing out that with all of this I've already said, question comes up, we've got a problem here. How do we handle it in our marriage? It's going to affect marriage, so what do we do? Well, he's going to give advice. Now, why is this necessary? comes back to what the present distress is. It has to be something significant enough to cause him to say something about they were worried about what to do, and he's given advice about whether to marry or not based upon it. So what is the present distress? The present necessity, literally. This is good because this means that I can tell you whatever, you're just going to accept it because you don't know. Right? Okay, it could be, do we have any evidence of this? We were just talking about persecution when we began. Not specifically, but that doesn't mean that's off the table now, Melanie. Because with marriage, you are looking at a lifetime. Now, there is another possibility, or I'll give you two other possibilities. Some have proposed that if you go back to Acts 11, it mentions a famine during the days of Claudius. Now, that could have been an issue, except this would have been written around 55 AD. Now, where are my Hebrew and Greek and all the history scholars? When did Nero come on? When did Claudius die and Nero ascend to the principate? It was 54. So that means that if there had been a famine, it wouldn't have been that one that he was talking about at this present time. Now, there could have been a localized famine. That's still possible. But we don't have any direct record of that specifically if we're going to use the reference to Claudius. However, there's something else to consider that does bring back Roman history into it. Whenever there was a changeover of emperors, sometimes you'd have to re-up and agree to all the kind of situations that you previously had, all the laws, and you'd agree to kind of come through and rubber stamp everything previously. And if you have a movement from 54 to 55, is it possible that what you had was that Nero needed and was slow because he wasn't exactly the most competent person to get all those things done, and that would have held up marriage? Possible but doubtful because of how the Romans conducted their law for people in other areas. They had a very strict legal system themselves, but when they conquered an area, they pretty much let that area's governance in general things continue as it was so long as they got proper tribute paid and they didn't cause any problems. So that's less likely. So let's return then, unless you have some other ideas, to Melanie's suggestion that we're dealing with persecution. The interesting problem is when he says the present distress. And again, distress here is, I think, the word is definitely necessity. What is basically the standing, ongoing necessity. That there was something going on that was creating problems for them. Now, as you go through the rest of this text, he's actually looking forward, when we get to the end of this section, to a lot of different things. They had definitely problems in the area of Jews coming around and creating problems for Paul and the Christians. That's without a question. You don't get as much direct notice of that in Corinth as you do, say, in Thessalonica. But it still is possible. But without then being able to just nail this down in an absolute way, now we're going to look at this with those possibilities. Now I want us to consider this in principle and look at what he actually says as his advice, which is, it's good for a man to remain as he is. That is, don't change anything. Don't get married. Not a good time for that. You don't need to be worried about going through all these things. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loose. Okay, he's reiterating this. But then, are you loose from a wife? Do not seek a wife. Don't change your current situation. Now, the most interesting part is actually the first one. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. That would indicate, having already gone through this previous section, that whatever the necessity was, that it was putting a stress on marriages that might cause them to want to separate to get out of the problem. You see that? Okay, now, see, how would you ever seen let me try to come up with a modern day situation. All right, let's go to taxes, because everyone loves taxes. Okay? And you can, let's say, you ever known someone who did not get married because their taxes would go up by being married? That's actually real. Okay, John? Two people receiving Social Security checks get married? Clearly you don't need the same amount of money because you're less of a person now, apparently. You know, so we change things, okay? So notice that we do actually have, though in a smaller way, we do have some of these finer things. It's financial. That very well could be something that they would face as well. Now, think about it this way. Most people were, Corinth was a wealthy city for its day. Right? It was a wealthy city. That didn't mean everyone was wealthy. Marriage could create major financial hardships. Now I'm going to go around and take a look around the room. And do you know of anybody that had to wait to get married during the Great Depression? I know we're so many years now removed from that. Maybe it's only some of us who are older that knew people that were in that situation. But they were not in a financial situation where they could really afford to get married. Okay. Trying to point out that these situations, while this seems so far removed, I think it's important for us to recognize these similar kind of situations. And again, I'm not trying to get us down to absolutely any one, but to appreciate the text, we need to appreciate even some of these examples that are far out there, because what if they were the norm? Okay, John? John, I hate to tell you this, but I have given up saying that Rome was so corrupt. I feel hypocritical doing that. I'm not going into politics, I'm just saying. It was very different. And it's hard actually to tell the corruption at the local levels. You had some people, there's evidence of some Christians serving in some of those capacities at Corinth. Okay? We have a name of someone from archaeology that was noted as having contributed to the good that occurs in Corinth. So it's a question. So the thing I want you to note, though, the background of this is there's a situation that is putting stress on marriage. Whether it is social stress, persecution, financial stress, but that was most certainly something that made it more difficult for them. That's why his judgment is it's best not to do that. But you don't divorce, but don't get married. That's the situation. So now look at verse 28, and now we understand more what he was saying in verse 25. But even if you do marry, you have not sinned. He just told them, don't get married, and then he says, but if you do, you've ignored me, you haven't sinned. That's why it was important for him to talk about the difference in judgment. He was saying, this is not a wise thing to do right now. But doing something that's not wise does not mean it's sinful always. Can you do something that's just dumb and it just be dumb? Y'all are acting like y'all have never done this. I want a little more honesty from the audience, please. Okay, thank you. So there is room for you just did something and it was just not a smart thing to do, but that doesn't mean that that was sin. Okay? Even if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Okay? Now, there's a little bit of difference in the wording here, but the idea is essentially the same. Notice what he says next, though. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. You're going to have some problems. Now, he specifies what the problems are in the flesh. What does he mean by that? In this life. This is dealing with just the things of this life. There are going to be some additional issues that you're going to have to face because of that. But I don't want to go into all of that. But I would spare you. I don't want to go and list everything. Now, he's about to tell them a little bit. But he doesn't go into detail. The last thing you want to hear is, okay, you're about to get married. Let me tell you about everything that you're going to have to do, okay? Interest rates are high, okay, you can do that, and they got that, and no, this bad job market, we got that, and, you got people, they're not going to hire Christians, that's a problem. Overall, economy not going so well, these people don't like us, rents are going up. We got our list, don't we? So he's warning them. So he says, it's okay if you go ahead, but I'm just going to give you this little warning that you got some stuff you're not expecting going to be there. Now, I'd like to say that's true of anybody that marries any time, right? But he's got something specific in mind here. So now we look at verse 29. But this I say, brethren, the time is short. Now we've got a different situation we have to figure out. And what is the time short in and for? The time is short so that from now on, even those who have wives should be as though they had none. We're going to read all through this because we have to go back through it. Those who weep as though they did not weep. Those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice. Those who buy as though they did not possess. And those who use this world as not misusing it. For the form of this world is passing away. Okay, we've got a series, so we'll talk about them individually, but what do they all share in common? You don't know either. What? Paco? You could say that about pretty much any letter Paul wrote, that there's some part of it that's difficult to understand. Yes. I think this counts. Okay. The time is short, and the wording here is different because it is a reference to the season, which tends to be a shorter time. It's stood together. Everything's piling up. The saying we're going a particular direction. What is he talking about? Well, it's in context that would indicate, again, going back to what the present distress was, and he's saying here, look, things are only going to get worse on this front. That there's some things that are going to be going on. It's characterized by what follows. And all of them, if you think about it, are a pleasant, positive situation that's going to become negative. All these things, and you think, well, what about the one about the weeping? What is someone who weeps as though they did not weep? Have you ever run into someone who didn't have time to mourn because they had to get on and just do stuff? I think about this specifically, and this is not what this is talking about, but to capture it, with those who fought in wars, and they had their pals, and they watched good friends die, and they witness it, and their next thing is having to move out and leave them just to try to save their own life and to do what they're supposed to do for the Army, Navy, whatever. You don't even get an opportunity in that way it's traumatic. That's in some way what you have is all these things that are basic things in life you should be able to take for granted. You're not going to be able to take for granted. Okay, now let's go back and take a look. The first one is, because of the context, is your marriage. Is even those who have wives should be as though they had none. You're going to be separated. A lot of ways that can happen, but your situation is going to be such that no one would know you're married. Someone's taken to prison, hauled off somewhere, has to go somewhere else. There are a lot of different things could happen. But the idea is that this is something that, in the context of marriage, which is why he starts there, is that you go into marriage with an understanding of this is going to be your life moving forward. And he's saying you're not going to be able to take all this for granted. He's saying tough times are coming for you as a Christian. John. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You're moved. If you, in Ukraine, okay, let's get up to this year. They had men who were going back to fight, who had made sure that their families were, in most cases, going to Poland for safety, going back to fight in Ukraine. Okay, that's just the circumstances. Now, you didn't have that kind of thing for Christians during the first century. You wouldn't have had that. But it does give a flavor to kind of the traumatic difficulties that situations could have created. So you can see that with you was being separated, pulled apart, not even having opportunity to weep and mourn. Those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice. Do you just take for granted laughter? Or being able to do things that just make you smile? And he's indicating that there could be situations in which there's not going to be any of that. Is the situation's too sad and intense where that's just kind of off the table. To show that it's a general thing of society, we keep moving on time. Those who buy as though they did not possess. How can you be someone who buys and yet you not possess it? You could be hiding your stuff, or it could be taken from you. Either way. And that certainly was a situation that people ran into for different reasons. You could do that because of, war would create that. Sometimes government policy could create that. Sometimes you just have to get out of there, and you can't take stuff with you, right? And so you've done all this, but you've got to go. How much do you think that that Mary and Joseph took with them when they had to leave, right? What they had. We think about if you're going to move, you're going to, call your mover company and haul up all your stuff and put it in truck, trailer, and we just relocate it. Well, what if the situation is such that it's dire, it's pretty much whatever you can take with you. If you've ever seen people that were, say, you're in the path of a storm or there's flood, and you're being evacuated. Fire comes through. Okay, you see that recent years in California the most. We've had them here too. But you've got to you take with you just the absolute necessities. Verse 31, and those who use this world as not misusing it. Now that's an interesting phrase. What does that mean? First of all, those who use this world. I've had a lot of silence today in my questions. Yeah. Farmers? I think that would be part of it. I think in Corinth you would have more business than farmers. Right? Deal with the world? Yeah, I would say that this is almost a summary statement of everything he's been talking about. He's coming to the bottom, and he's basically saying that all these things that have to do with the world, now the word that's translated misusing it, it's related to what he had said, in that you use something you're trying to make use of it, and then this word adds the idea of in a bad way or down. You can't make any use of it. There's nothing that you can do with anything. Okay, so in that sense, it's not exactly a business term of buying and selling, but it's a general term of the idea of everything that you typically would be able to do in life you can't do. Is no benefit to you. Why? That's where he ends when he says, for the form of this world is passing away. Now, we only have 2 minutes. There are two words, I think only 2 words, that are translated as form in the New Testament. This, we tend to think of form like what you see in Philippians chapter 2, where you have Jesus took on the form, right? He existed the form of God. He took on the form of man, right? And that's the word that's associated with the form as Plato's ideal, if you've ever studied that. This is not that word. This is the word schema, okay, which has to do, you look at a scheme, you put out a print out a scheme, it has to do with the outer fashion. And so it's a lot more for history, society. Bell just rang, the clock says 10:44. Somebody could use a watch for Christmas. Society is not going to be as it is right now. I'm going to leave you with this. We've had a lot of advantages in America over the years that have made it possible for us to worship freely and teach freely and do all these things and enjoy a very comfortable life without having to make a lot of tough decisions. Don't act like that's always a guarantee, because he's saying it's not. And it wasn't for them, I'm not a prophet about all this. I'm just saying, when we start organizing our life as Christians and we use the basis of it, current America society, we've got the wrong foundation for what we're doing. Foundation's Christ. Anything that America provides is good, positive, that's a plus. Don't get them confused. All right, we will pick up there next week.